Today's first reading is from the book of Job, and yesterday we would have had the introduction to the book of Job, but yesterday we had the feast of the Canadian secondary martyrs of Canada, and so we kind of missed the opening of the book of Job. But if you recall, what happens is that Satan mocks God and basically is saying that Job is only faithful because everything is going well for him. So God allows Satan to afflict Job, but without harming him. And later on, God will even allow Satan to harm Job physically. So we know that he loses his family, he loses his possessions, he's in a miserable state. And then later on, he's physically miserable also. He's got all kinds of sores all over him. Anyways, some of his friends come and they kind of tell him, look, Job, like you're in a pitiable state. Why don't you just curse God? And Job never curses God, and this is very significant. But in today's reading, he curses the day of his own birth, and he longs for death because he's miserable. He's in a state of extreme depression. He's extremely down. He's lost everything. He's got nothing to live for. And as as the story goes on, we know that in the end that Job is made whole again. He recovers and he gains even more than he had initially, and he has a huge family afterwards. So God blesses him abundantly. Now we might ask the question, well, why did God allow Satan to afflict Job in this way? Isn't God being cruel by allowing Satan to do this? The reality is that when God created the angelic beings, there's different choirs of angels, as we know, but certain angels were appointed to help man, human beings, to help us, to guide us, to protect us, So we think of the good angels, the guardian angels, right? But some of these angels rebelled against God. And just because they rebelled against God and separated themselves from God, they don't lose their abilities, they don't lose the function or the purpose for which they were created. So the reality is that the fallen demonic beings, they can continue to influence us. And the reality is that God limits their influence upon us. So they can tempt us, and they do tempt us. And in certain cases, certain individuals might become possessed even. So God allows this, but God limits their activity, because if he didn't, we'd have way more people possessed. So in reality, when Satan asks for greater freedom to be able to harass Job and to afflict him, he's really only asking for what he kind of rightly deserves. And God is saying, okay, I'll allow you a little bit of greater freedom here. And this is interesting because it's very similar to the vision of Pope Leo XIII. So if you could recall, Pope Leo XIII, one day he had a vision and he heard Satan and Christ speaking, and Satan was mocking Christ. And so Christ gives Satan 100 years of greater dominion, of greater influence, not over an individual like Job, but over the church, to afflict the church. And so that many members in the church will become like Job. They'll become discouraged, despondent, and they'll curse God, or they'll rebel against God, or they'll leave the church. And we see this happening today. So Satan uses the media. Satan uses government leaders who are all under his control because they only care about power, and so they don't care about the fact that they're suppressing people or taking away their freedoms and all these things. And eventually, religion will be suppressed also. Once these totalitarian regimes are in place, freedom of religion will be taken away. And Christians will really suffer at that time. So they will grieve because they will be like Job, who lost all his family. We will be like Christians who've lost our churches, who lost our religious freedom. So how will we respond? Will we abandon our faith in God? Will we curse God, or will we be like Job, who perseveres in his loyalty to God, even though he complains? He complains to God. And the key to understanding this is that there's a reason as to why Job is suffering. He doesn't understand the reason entirely. But God has a plan for Job. And if Job remains faithful, Job is going to receive way more than he lost. He will be far more greatly compensated. And it's similar to the parable that we had this past Sunday, the rich man and Lazarus. If you recall, the poor man Lazarus was in a pitiable condition. He was suffering a lot. Now, it's not because he was being harassed by demons, but nature was taking its course. Maybe he was born into a poor family. Maybe his parents died, whatever the reason might be. Maybe he had some illness or disease. But anyways, he suffered a lot. But God rewarded him. God had greater compassion on him. And so he ends up in the bosom of Abraham, whereas the rich man ends up in Hades, in hell. So we have to remain faithful to God no matter what. And the reality is that when we understand that there's a reason for everything, it makes it easier to kind of endure those difficulties. So if Job had known that he was being tested, it would have been easier for him to persevere. He didn't know. So knowing our purpose is important. And, in today's gospel reading, it's interesting how our Lord, he's traveling through this Samaritan town, but he doesn't want to stay because his face is set toward Jerusalem. In other words, he's intent on going to Jerusalem because the time of his passion has come. In other words, he is going to accomplish his purpose. And in order to accomplish his purpose, the salvation, to make salvation possible for all men, he himself must suffer. He himself must be afflicted. And the soldiers that scourged our Lord and crucified him, Satan was spurring them on to be extremely cruel, to whip him even more than they ought to have. So our Lord himself takes on this great suffering. So in many ways, Job is a prefigurement of Christ, that by means of his suffering, a greater good is going to come about. And the important lesson here for all of us is that all of us also have a purpose. We have a destiny. We have a goal. And it's not happiness in this life. If that's what we're seeking, we're deluding ourselves. We're not going to find it. And the reality is that each one of us are also going to have to face sufferings. We may even feel down and depressed like Job did. But the important thing is that we always remain faithful to God. That we don't abandon our faith. That we don't curse God for the miseries that we may be encountering or the hardships we may be suffering. Like Job, we need to persevere. We need to be faithful, whether we understand our purpose or not. So our purpose, our destiny, is to make it to heaven, and we're just passing through this world. We're only here for a short time. Even if we have to suffer our entire lives, it is as nothing compared to eternity. We would be far better off to be like the poor man in Sunday's parable than being well off in this world and neglecting our relationship with God. So let us trust God no matter what, and let us ask our guardian angels to be there for us, to console us, to comfort us, and to strengthen us so that we can face whatever challenges, whatever difficulties, whatever sufferings we may have to face.